Warm greetings from the Center for National Security Studies. I'm your host, Balasubramanian, Senior Research Officer and Head of the Strategic Studies Program at CNSS. Today, we are in a conversation with our distinguished guest, Mr. Yuvraj Ghimire, on the topic Echoes from the Himalayas, Decoding Nepal's Power, Progress, and Geopolitics. To introduce our guest for today, Mr. Ghimire is a leading media personality and a veteran journalist with a career spanning over 3 decades in journalism. He is currently the editor of Desh Sanchar, a journalistic multimedia venture in Nepal. Previously, he worked as a journalist in prestigious international media like BBC World Service from London and prestigious Indian media like India Today, Outlook, The Telegraph, and the Indian Express. Thank you very much, sir, for taking time to be with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
To get into the questions, let me start from 2024, where Nepal saw the formation of a new coalition government between the CPN and the UML and the Nepali Congress, which was led by Prime Minister K.P. How do you think this coalition has impacted political stability, and what challenges do you think remain in maintaining the unity given their ideological differences?
Well, Nepal has almost always been ruled by coalition governments in the past 2 decades or more. But I'm emphasizing in these past decades of radical change when Nepal became a federal republic and new constitution was being written. But the 2024 experiment was very different in the sense that two main opponents, which had got the people's mandate to be number one and number two parties in the last election, that was 2024, they joined hands together on a not so much on the agenda, but based on an understanding that this would be rotational leadership. The same parties, but rotational leadership. First half led by Uli of UML, and second half by Deuba. So the government in the second half, until the elections next time, would be led by Sherbahadur Deuba, who is the chairman of the Nepali Congress. So it has been a very unstable and very unaccountable government, because the two parties together almost constitute two-thirds majority. So the message they have sent across is they don't have to be accountable to the people in parliament, and they are above laws, and what the two leaders or two parties decide becomes something of the law, above the constitution. That has really, and this has resulted in developmental activities being left in the background, and corruption it's a very sad thing to talk about developments in Nepal. If there is one thing that is really, really transparent, that is corruption in Nepal, and that corruption goes unaddressed, with the ruling side taking no accountability absolutely.
From 2024, let me bring you quickly to the March 2025, where the pro-monarchy state of protest has been happening in Kathmandu, demanding the reinstatement of former king. What do you think are the underlying causes of such public disillusionment with Nepal's federal republic system, and how do you think all these protests reflect broader tensions between the monarchy and democracy in Nepal?
It's a very important question, but I think I must spell out the perspective in Nepal. Unlike India, when it became independent in 1947 August, it also became a republic. So in India, republic and democracy are seen as like two sides of the same coin. Here in Nepal, that was not the case. And Nepal, the challenge moves where that monarchy acts as constitutional institutions with multi-party democracy functioning, with all the features of democracy, independent judiciary, principle of separation power being practiced, and all that. So, in 2006, when Nepal went through a series of tragedy at the beginning of this period, palace massacre took place. King Rajendra, the surviving brother, and was the closest to the succeeding line became the king based on decision taken by the constitutional body called Raj Sabha, which was also joined by the prime minister, leader of the opposition there. That means it was an exceptional case where the king was appointed by a body which are the government's aid and opposition aid. But in 2005, when Nepal was suffering from civic unrest, insurgency with the Maoists leading it, then the king took over, saying he wants to rule for 3 years and he will sort out the insurgency, then hand over power to the political party. That was not acceptable to political parties, and even we criticized it, saying that the constitution doesn't provide that right to the king. And then a movement, India did play a very begin the Maoists, but India brought Maoist and civic political parties together on the plea that the terrorism of Nepal will have spillover effect if not unaddressed. If not addressed, and they need to be brought to political mainstream and democratic process. So that variant role India played. But what happened after that was, in the movement, King agreed to hand over power to the political parties. He appointed prime minister who was recommended by the agitating or protesting political parties on understanding that monarchy will continue to be there. But then there was a breach of understanding. In May, at this stage, the monarchy was seen as a victim. People are not involved in the process of sidelining or removing the monarchy. One. Two, when monarchy was removed, the process, it was absolute rejection of established democratic norms and process. It was like, let me explain to the Indian audience. It was like in 2014, Modi became the prime minister. Modi's party, got the majority. New parliament got constituted. But after parliament was constituted, what you do is you form a government, that government transacts the business. Here in Nepal, the Constituent Assembly was elected, and that Constituent Assembly's business was carried by the old government, J.P. Parala's government, who had lost its majority, and the Constituent Assembly met. There the whole, that whole government, did conduct the whole business of Home Minister, who according to the rules of the business of the House, previous Home Minister, did not have the right to enter Constituent Assembly in Parliament. That was specifically mentioned. He enters and says, okay, Nepal is now a republic, henceforth, and they can, and Nepal becomes a republic. In fact, nobody, it was not an acceptable parliamentary process, but it was such a euphoric movement. Nepal became republic that way. People's choice or what they wanted was never tested. That's why monarchy from that point was seen as a victim. And now, 20 years down the line, with corruption so much rampant, with governance without any accountability, with economic situation dwindling down, and law and order situation very bad, king is seen as a victim, monarchy is seen as a victim, people are seen as victims. So two victims have come together. And third, general impression is things were much better during the monarchy's time. Although it has not been debated and tested, still the worst problem is political parties haven't reviewed their failures, haven't responded positively to the people's demand that there must be a course correction. And there must be somehow people's will must be taken into account. After all, it's a democracy.
The protests have been drawing large number of crowds. So, do you think that it could lead to restoration of the status quo ante?
Well, I told you, monarchy is seen as a victim. of a conspiracy by the 7 political parties. Somehow, India couldn't foresee that this, 7 political parties now is coming together for restoration of democracy doesn't lead to an anarchic situation and unaccountable governance. I think that was India's failure, not to be able to assess that. Although the same policy continues today, but Nepalese people never got the chance to have their say on crucial agenda of importance. Say, for instance, Nepal became, I'm not saying whether Nepal should be a secular or not be. Nepal used to be Hindu country. What the 7 plus 8 political party leaders was, they declared Nepal would be a secular country. And they never debated what constitutes secularism. What is the interrelation between, religion and state affairs and people's right to profess a particular religion or not to accept. This was never tested. This is just one-line declaration. Now, what has happened is, what has created a kind of unrest is, when you call secularism, it is basically the right to convert, and now American Congress, a few months ago after Trump, to second term, they said about 500 million to 1,000 billion had spent on promoting Buddhism in Nepal. So that is basically in a Hindu-dominated country or society, you promote atheism, neutralize people's faith, and in that neutralized state, you go and convert. So, secularism and right to conversion and right to freedom of religion are absolutely different things. But what I'm saying is, these issues never got debated in Nepal's parliament. It was dictated more by the whims of 8 political parties, more than 8 political parties, their leaders. And I'll tell you one more thing. When Nepal's constitution was being drafted by not one, 2 constituent assemblies, because two elections took place, it doesn't happen anywhere. They never allowed the debate of any one article, 308 articles. Not a single article was debated in the full house. Not a single amendment was allowed to be moved. Nepal's constitution also, although constitutional assembly was elected, it didn't do the work. It was basically, external experts, even INGOs, writing the constitution and pushing through, depending on the root budget of the 8 political parties, who didn't allow any kind of debate or involvement of the people to decide what they want.
In all this, what is happening in Nepal, where does the Nepali army stand? What is the stance of the Nepali army regarding the pro-monarchy protest, and how do you think it is responding?
Well, it's a very interesting question. Nepal army was initially when 2006 this political change, when King handed over political parties, and when the peace accord was signed between Maoist and Nepali Congress. They were both on the same side. The major flaw in that peace process was that not all sides of the country were involved. Monarchy was a key stakeholder in that peace process. It was totally excluded, and those traditional forces were excluded. And the UN took the lead. I think UN took the lead. United Nations mission to Nepal was constituted under the leadership of Ian Martin, who was already here as representative of the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights. So he took the new lead, and their one agenda was to humiliate and isolate the Nepal army and to totally restructure it, saying it was a private army of the Nepal monarchy, which was not the case. Nepal army did play a role in unification of Nepal, but it was not a private army. It was a group. They insulted and humiliated the Nepal army, but unfortunately, because of the misgovernance that began after that, without accountability. Government can be misgoverning, but they have to be accountable. They never became accountable, and people started expressing somehow their faith. Is perhaps RB, Nepal RB, is the only state-bearing institutions. Although it hasn't spread out its might, but what is understandable is if there is any kind of crisis, they will turn towards Nepal RB. Whether it's a right approach, it's a wrong approach, that unfortunately is the case, but it has not spaced its mind. But I think a situation might come under which if there is any law and order problem, army has to take account of in this kind of situation which may emerge. That unfortunately is the scenario. Was an institution not trusted by the regime after 2008 and the United Nations, which did play a role in the peace process and excluding major stakeholders in the conflict and of course peace.
My next question is on PM Oli's visit to India. He's likely to visit India in the third week of September 2025. What do you think will be the top priorities on his agenda? Because you have Nepal dynamics with China also, and also there's a relationship with India. So what do you think will be top of his priority on his agenda, and how much can be translated on the ground?
Visit in Nepal and India by their executive heads used to be a reciprocal kind of diplomatic exercise in the past, but given the number of changes in the leadership of the Nepal government, it may not be possible for India to host all the prime ministers because they keep saying that at the end of 10 months, 11, Korea has survived more than a year. And hopefully, if the Nepali Congress body agree to stick to their previous formula, it will continue. But only is one is Nepal's relationship with China and Nepal relation with India. There was in 2015 September when Nepal promulgated its constitution, very not well accepted in Nepal also, but because there was this movement of euphoria, change, Nepal's youngest republic and all that. The blockade that followed, economic blockade that followed, more than 4 months by India, that spoiled the relationship between the two countries. Only did play a major role in signing trade and transit agreement with China, which was so it basically created an alternative access route to the sea in the sense. How was practical or not? Nepal's nearest port to China is about 3,200 kilometers. Whether it can substitute the Arabic India, that's one thing. But he did that. And also this border issue, Kalapani liquidity and all that. That's not the Bondo. So not a new issue. I remember in 2000 July when G.P. Kerala had called to India as Prime Minister, this issue had come up. And Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee had said that India is not interested in Nepal's territory, but let's form some mechanism. But that mechanism didn't pursue the issue. Nepal and India have the habit of, pushing these major issues, issues under the carpet, and not trying to solve it for once. And why I'm saying is in 1961, Nepal and China had boundaries to be sorted out. I did talk to one of the key players of that in Nepal, who is Mr. K.P. was Prime Minister. So he quoted Tamil Nadu and Mao Zedong, telling him that we must sort out this border dispute because if we don't do it now, for future generations it will be emotive issues and more difficult to address. This is one of the key players telling me. In Nepal and India's case, the border disputes would be natural because now you have border system, but in the time they used to be river, working as borders, they would change course and all that, but they will not make serious efforts to address it. From Atal Bihari Vajpayee to Narendra Modi, this problem remains there. So what and so Modi and Modi had difficult relations, equations, and also BRI got signed in 2007, although it's not been implemented as per the latest speed of that, to which was definitely not liked by India. So all these issues, and after the blockade, the blockade issues were over. But now I think there are those, there's difficult relations between the two executive heads and disturbed. And other issue is the EPG report, Immediate Cost Groups report, which because Prime Minister Modi didn't accept it or didn't spare for the time for it, it's in limbo. Is gathering dust perhaps. So these are issues which that there was lack of enthusiasm on the part of hosting Modi in continuation to the traditional approach. But it seems he's going to go there. Will depend much on India's internal politics also, because there are huge scale of conflict around the world which affect this part of the world and India. We are hopeful that Modi will go, but much will depend on about the issues. End of July, there was a bilateral meeting between two home secretaries on extradition, non-pending extradition, mutual legal assistance, and there will be other impending projects also. But basically, the whole thing is building trust. If they succeed in that, all problems will be taken care of. But our enabling atmosphere has to be created. That's the challenge, and perhaps the most important agenda between the two prime ministers.
My next question is on the Madheshi. What is the current situation with the Madheshi community? What do you think are the present dynamics surrounding their issues?
Well, the Madheshi community is not one homogeneous community which Indian officialdom seems to believe at times. It comprises about 17% of the national geography, 51 plus 52% of the population. But it's a heterogeneous, geography and demography. There are people who have been living there for generations. It's a very fertile area. There are people from the hills who have migrated for economic reasons. There are indigenous populations. There are people who have migrated from UP and Bihar earlier, now UP and Bihar are mostly. So it's basically a very heterogeneous geography. So at times Indian media and official version comes to they try to project that as one homogeneous entity, all Indian origin and deprived blood. That is, yes, political, like now in democracy, you have to have people from hills, mountains, mothers. Yes, there have been evolutionary process in that origin also. There have been movement in Tarai and the system has been accounted not now. 60s onwards it began. Sorry. But now, after the 2006 change, there were demands for right to secede with the Maoists raised this issue, autonomy, and then it was extreme kind of this thing. One. Second, I'll just give you an example to again explain. We have on the Nepal side in Janakpur, where King Janak's capital, erstwhile palace, and some remnants of that are there living. People identify themselves with that. The huge extended territory of that tribe lies in Mithila area in India. Now, what do you say? That the people living in Mithila region of Nepal are Indians living on the other side they are of Indian origin or Nepal origin. That is pointless debate. The issue is we have the people of both sides have common ancestry, common heritage. They are bound by that common reality. So because that time, so what I'm saying, diplomacy needs to acknowledge its factors not aggravate the issue by saying that it's a people of Indian origin. This is not entirely Indian origin. Yes, UP and Bihar. Like, I'll explain again. There are Yadavs in Tarak. There are other Yadavs in Bihar and UP. But they don't win. Who is the originating, ethnic groups? So that's what I'm saying. And diplomacy must take into account these realities and ethnic factors and not give them a linguistic cover. That has aggravated the problems. So, Madhesi communities, like they have formed the political parties, but there is problems among those political parties also. They are divided. But like all the other parties, these Nepali Congress even, they are also totally unpopular in the eyes of their voters because of the rampant corruption they are indulging in.
Speaking of corruption, I just would like to seek your first-hand inputs on Nepal's economy. Nepal grew 4.5% into the financial year 2025, which was primarily driven by tourism, remittance, and hydropower export. Where does Nepal economy stand today? Because remittance, we also have the risk of over-reliance on remittance. So, what is the current state of Nepal's economy?
Well, unfortunately, it's not repeating the same, rate of growth projection also in the current budget, which came about 1.5 months ago. The same growth projection figure. But the point is, remittance you mentioned, hydro potential you mentioned about. The other thing is, there has been no enabling or favorable policies for foreign direct investment. Government makes commitment, but they are not implemented. Many potential investors have told us actually that Nepal government promises a lot, doesn't do anything. The huge potential, definitely. Hydro, yes. Now, again, I think we'll be discussing this issue again. But hydro, despite Nepal's huge hydro potential, and they are considering this issue only in terms of selling or exporting, not in terms of the domestic need for, possible industrialization, for, to do. After all, electricity is also part of the rising lifestyle of the people. Electricity failure would lead to disaster in the social, political, and individual life. Nepal government hasn't gone to that. They are only thinking in terms of generating and exporting. Two, I told you about their lack of encouraging policy or state behavior towards inviting foreign direct investment. That's lacking. Third, agricultural production is also suffering because it never picked up after the insurgency decade. Because most people, able-bodied people in the agriculture belt, rural areas, they left the country, for safety reasons. So it has not been able to pick up. So, overall economy that is suffering. And remittance has naturally, contributed remarkably in Nepal's GDP, but the point is it has social and other costs also. People are debating about it, which doesn't become more of a area of study and interest for the world outside, but Nepal is a real problem.
During the course of your response, you mentioned about foreign investment. Speaking of foreign investment in Nepal, particularly from China, you have the One Belt and One Road, and the US, they have something called the MCC, which has, in the past faced controversy regarding sovereignty and execution. How do you look at all these?
You mentioned this competing or parallel look like any concept. It was there are section of Nepali political spectrum opposed or supported depending on your ideological commitment. But the point is, this issue never got debated in Nepal's parliament, like the constitution. MCC, a minister goes and signs, and the country only gets to know about it when you had to introduce it or parliamentary ratification is per the agreement that two countries have. So if it is something in the interest of Nepal, why can't you build a consensus? Same with OBOR. It used to be OBOR, now it is Belt and Road Initiative. They signed and they conceded from the people. So that gives credence to ongoing public debate and fear that our leaders are sold out. They do something for their own interest. They refuse to be pro-Nepali, but they refuse to be they accept to be pro-American or pro-Chinese. Otherwise, why in a project signed 8 years ago, the 8 political parties why can't they debate and come to a consensus? Now, Prime Minister Modi went to China a few months ago. He signed the framework agreement for that. But the point is, the ruling party, Nepali Congress, was saying that, okay, we accept projects only on grant. That is a ridiculous plea. Why it has to be China-specific decision not to take any bid? Why you can America gave the MCC? That's just one this thing. It's a 500 billion project. Now, this is not going to be scrapped even after Trump's decision to suspend US all that. But you have taken loan from different countries. Nepal is huge there. But why are you making that specific condition for China? If you need, and if you build your credibility, and if you are in a position to repay it, sorry, and if you are confident enough that this project will be beneficial and contribute to Nepal's economic growth and development, you repay that. So part of it was correct, but China initially on this Belt and Road Initiative, I think they surface really talked about 35 projects, came down to 9 projects. This would be viable for Nepal, but they haven't moved forward. But China-Nepal connectivity is now much more intense. There are already 14 different connecting points. Road and highways are being built. So this absence of clarity and absence of debate on that, the absence of people, our leaders' inability to decide what Nepal needs and how will that benefit Nepal is the major problem. Not whether MCC comes or whether BRI comes. That's not the problem.
In the last 1 month, the one topic that has been globally closely followed is the succession of the Dalai Lama. So, from Nepal, speaking from Nepal's standpoint, how do you think intelligence sharing agreements with China to curb pro-Tibetan activities align with Nepal's security priorities?
Well, like when Dalai Lama fled Tibet, then he came back. I think Dalai Lama has been to Nepal just once. Nepal has adopted two very clear stance on its relation with China right from King's time and up to now. That is, one China policy and Tibet being integral, autonomous province of China. Nepal is very clear about it. And Nepal has assured China, like it has assured India, that it will not allow its territory to enter Chinese activities. So there are about 25,000 refugees, Tibetan refugees living in Nepal, but Nepal discourages this Tibetan, anti-Chinese activities because it knows the consequence. Secondly, so Nepal as a government hasn't entered into Dalai Lama controversy, although Dalai Lama's followers and these Tibetan Mahayana gurus are in evidence in Nepal. They have got huge following among the Nepalese also. But Nepal government hasn't got into this, and it's basically it will be discouraging any activity that will bring Tibetan issue, including the controversy about Dalai Lama's successors here. But the point is, it's a faith-based thing. Supposing tomorrow they declare that Dalai Lama's successor is born in Nepal, that will be a difficult issue for Nepal to entertain, and how Dalai Lama's institution decides to take it further is that. But Nepal, I understand, will not get into this controversy.
Speaking of Nepal's priority in developing cybersecurity cooperation with India, how do you think Nepal plans to balance this with its digital connectivity projects with China? With this, I'm referring to the Trans-Himalayan multi-dimensional connectivity network, which Nepal intends to develop with China.
Well, as of now, in Nepal, there's the both terrestrial and submarine this digital connectivity. 90% of the service providers are India, and 5 to 10% would be China. But this will be an unavoidable, march of, digital era. Only thing is, they have to take precaution about its misuse and autonomy that Nepal requires to assert is a component of that understanding. But again, at the moment, I think Nepal, Nepal's connectivity with China maybe remains between 5 to 10%, leaving the huge share to India or BBI also, a small part of BBI also. So, but again, Nepal hasn't defined its priority and autonomy in these issues. Unfortunately, they are the secondary issues.
Nepal is also the second most vulnerable country to mortality risk from natural disasters due to climate change, and South Asia as a whole is also facing transboundary climate challenges such as water sharing dispute, and we have rivers like Kosi, Gandaki. How do you think Nepal can collaborate with India to address these issues, in terms of climate security and disaster preparedness?
Well, Nepal has obviously, you can call it collaborated or worked jointly with India in the right from the 60s on this thing. Although climate crisis is a very latest kind of development, yes, we were talking about Kosi and Gandak and all that. Nepal, like India's Uttarakhand, Nepal is very vulnerable. The nature and destructive potential of the topography of the area, few of those rivers, fed by flash floods and tributaries and all that. But I think there are two different issues. Kosi and Gandak, when they were signed at projects between India and Nepal in the 60s, grievances on this side is lack of appreciation and the implementation of the bases made in those projects. Now, that time, I partly does the politics of 2006 change. That time, Nepal, India, surrounded by three sides, all the trades, movements, even diplomatic dealings, despite Nepal on record saying that it adopts a policy of equidistance between two neighbors. There's a historical background to that and all that. But Nepal's major dealings and special relations was with India. But I think what constituted special relation with Nepal, it has to be somehow reviewed in the current context. I'll tell you a few examples. One is now Gurkha is almost over. That used to be free movement, no passport visa. Although now it's like on arrival visa. It's not called visa, but your passport gets stamped during air travel. During monarchy, like Nepal under the Shankaracharya, this Puri much of the Shankaracharya is still. And like Pashupatinath, you have from your state, priest from Udupi. That is the cultural religion, but huge bearing on politics and diplomatic relations. And he will have, apart from Sankaracharya and the priest of those respective temples, the king of Nepal would be the only authority to be able to enter the sanctum sanctorum of all the major temples there, be it Rameswaram, Ayodhya, Banaras, and all that, Puri, Jagannath Puri, and all that. So that, during the time of crisis, blockade took place in 1889 also, like the war in 2015. But there were multiple leverages, royalties, their relatives, there are many leverages, which is not the case now. So Nepal's, in its over-enthusiasm, I won't call over-enthusiasm, maybe it was a true commitment. Nepal declares itself secularism, but they didn't realize what would be its impact on, Nepal's cultural relation with India, or that tradition. They didn't grievances in Nepal is not why there is republic, there is secularism, or there is federalism. Why it was not divided, why there was not a larger understanding or common position on those issues. It was hijacked by 8 leaders, and our 8 leaders were not solely working in their national interest. Second point I want to come here in this issue is now on hydro. Earlier, China would very clearly believe in, act like between India, Nepal, and China. India has the interest on Nepal vis-a-vis China. But in the 2006, it was not only in India's concern was considered legitimate in Nepal with Indian politics, because it said that Maoist terrorism in Nepal will have a spillover effect. But then India also involved America and Western countries in Nepal's political change, internal politics. And China at that point changed its policy. Why is India bringing those countries in Nepal? So it started increasing its level of interest and involvement in Nepal. And when President Xi Jinping came here 6 years ago, he said China is interested in few areas for investment. One of them was hydro energy. Now solar energy is also coming there. The trade and investment, reconstruction, upgrades, reconstructions, trade and commerce. So India, in true sense, now Chinese investment is increasing. So if you have your investment on the rise, then obviously you would want a favorable regime. And so for favorable regime, then you deal into politics. So far, only India was getting paid. Now, China is also getting the blame for the same. That's the case. And so Nepali politics, because China and India are that way, in that sense, superpower India in Nepal's internal politics, because they have started siding one against the other. Sometimes they side with India, sometimes they side with Nepal, rarely debating or trying to build a consensus on what makes you pro-Nepal.
My next question, where I would like to solicit your views on jihadist group. From the Nepal's perspective, how is Kathmandu addressing the security challenges? Yes. My next question is on the jihadist groups in Nepal. Such as Harkat-ul-Jihad al-Islami, Ansar Ghazwat-ul-Hind, which potentially exploiting Nepal's open border with India. So how do you think Kathmandu is addressing the security challenges posed by these jihadist groups?
Really, as we briefly touched in other countries on this issue, I guess, open border can be addressing can be like us, depending on the situation. Nepal's problem is not its intent that it wants to promote or encourage terrorism, any kind of terrorism against India or any kind of activities against China. Nepal's problem is, like lack of credibility and trustworthiness of the government. That's not only a external front, the home front also. I told you this Nepal's past 20 years record has shown that they are absolutely unaccountable to the extent that they have invented a new theory of policy decision. Any policy corruption cannot be investigated. If you are a prime minister, if your cabinet are decided in favor of the most corrupt, like issues, they cannot be investigated. So they absolutely totalitarian and authoritarian approach where the rulers are above the law. So Nepal has, we know that Nepal has cooperated with India. It's a reciprocal thing against terrorism. Although India is being blamed for, like having collaborated with the Maoists, the same Maoists who we call terrorists. But both India and this, but in other situations, both India and Nepal have cooperated with each other against terrorism, against forces or individuals working against the peace and tranquility and for subversion of activities there. During FPT time, we know that many FPT leaders when come here, they were returned to India. India has returned, like several Maoist leaders and all that also. That has happened. But if there is any problem of fear, I would say fear, no Nepali government would say that we promote terrorism against India. The only thing is absolute lack of credibility and weak governance. And also here, we have to be, every country is said SARC is not functional, but even SARC, even they were determined against terrorism, but the countries are aligning with terrorism in one or the other form, linking national interest. That is another side of sad aspect. We'll need a separate, a time for this discussion.
My last question to you is, in April 2025, the Uttar Pradesh government, made a campaign to remove all the illegal encroachment, including a lot of unrecognized mosques and madrasas, including other religious structures within the 15-kilometer radius of India-Nepal border. How do you think will it have a bearing or implications on, India-Nepal bilateral security cooperation and Nepal's border management policies?
Well, this is definitely a very difficult issue and very challenging issue. But, we know that there are funding for these madrasas, no proper monitoring of these madrasas, whether it's purely educational activities or beyond that, very poor budgetary mechanism. But for joint patrolling and all that, it has to be two countries. UP government intent is that, but it has to be two countries understanding and arrangement. If it's a common problem, then it has to be a kind of bilateral arrangement, agreement, and then evolving or developing a joint mechanism. But this is definitely a challenge, not only in that area, other parts of the country also.
As we come to the conclusion of this podcast, any concluding thoughts from you, sir, regarding the India-Nepal bilateral ties, bilateral relations? Any concluding thoughts from you, sir?
Sorry, this voice is getting bigger.
As we come to the end of this podcast, any concluding thoughts from you, sir, for regarding the India-Nepal bilateral ties?
Well, I think still, despite all those setbacks in the past and confusion, and I'll say from Indian perspective, as a Nepali, watching India also, that was a major liberations in India, like collaborating with the Maoists, and its consequences in Nepal have really become huge. And Nepal's internal politics should be best left to the Nepalese. Although I won't blame India alone. I blame more the Nepali leaders for this. And we are in the mess at the moment. But on the positive side, India-Nepal relations are unique, huge potential, and if you identify certain parameters, what makes the two countries deeper in friendship and with a prosperous common future, then you have to be very sensitive about certain things which the two governments should be working out. But what we have witnessed here is people have been left out in these radical changes. So this change has become very unpredictable, unstable, and not being respected by the people in Nepal.
Thank you so much, sir. That brings us to the end of today's episode. A big thank you to our guest, Mr. Yuvraj Timbre, for spending valuable time with us and offering such first and invaluable insights.